So, hi everyone, and welcome to the third session of the Mediated Memories of Responsibility seminar series, which is part of the MLR seminar in cultural memory. My name is Guido Bartolini. I am a postdoctoral fellow at University College Cork, where I work on the cultural memory of Italian fascism, and I am the curator of this seminar series, which I have co-organized together with Joe Ford from MLR and Selina Daly from Royal Holloway, University of London. So the Mediated Memories of Responsibility seminar series focuses on past wrongdoings, mainly, committed by European nations, and on the role that cultural products play in addressing such events and disseminating memories about past injustices. The series adopts a multinational and interdisciplinary perspective, bringing together scholars that work on different events, different historical events within various European cultures in order to foster dialogue and exchange within the humanities. So today you're going to listen to three quite diverse presentations touching you upon different events and topics, which, however, will resonate, together and will allow us to reflect on the notion of responsibility, which will be addressed either as a component of the memory culture of a given society, or instead as a value that informs cultural practices, activism, as well as the activities and work of scholarship. So before introducing the first speaker and beginning the actual event, let me just remind you of a few practical things. So please, as you're already doing, keep your microphone muted. That this will help the quality of the event. You are going to be able to ask questions, via the chat at any time of the event. So please, if you have comments, if you have ideas, or if you have a question in your mind, you can write it always in the chat, which will be monitored throughout the event. And then when the time of the question and day will come at the end of the three presentations, you will be allowed actually to come on screen and ask your question, or otherwise, we will just read the question in the chat. And as usual, we can also raise your virtual hand during the question and day and come along and speak. So the event is recorded. So in case, I need to inform you of that. In case you don't want to appear in the recording, please just switch off the camera. And the other practical element is that I need to just state, that we were lucky to receive funds, from Royal Holloway, University of London, through HARI, the Humanities and Art Research Institute, and also from UCML, the University Council of Modern Languages, which we thank, for the support that they gave to the series. Okay, so yeah, without further ado, I'm just glad to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Willem Blacker, who is lecturer in comparative East European culture at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies of University College London. So his research focuses on the literature and cultures of Ukraine, Poland, and Russia, and specifically on questions of post-war cultural memory. His monograph, Memory, the City, and the Legacy of World War II in East Central Europe, Ghosts of Others, was published by Routledge in 2019. He's also the co-author of Remembering Catione and co-editor of Memory and Theory in Eastern Europe. The title of his talk today is The Colonizer Decided Everything: Responsibility, Victimhood, and the Holocaust in Ukrainian Memory Culture.
Thank you so much, Guido, for the introduction. I'll just share my slides. Hopefully that's visible to everybody. Okay, so I changed the title slightly, but the essence of the paper is the same. But the abstract that I sent you and that was published online said that I would look at two different sites of Holocaust memory, one in Lviv in Western Ukraine and one in Kiev in Central Ukraine. I won't talk about Kiev and Babyn Yar, I'll talk only about Lviv, but I'll be happy to answer questions related to Babyn Yar as well as an important Holocaust memory site in the Q&A if anyone's interested. Okay. So in his 2012 novel Tango of Death, it says 2012, it's a mistake on the slide, sorry. The Ukrainian writer Yuri Vinichuk described a scene in which two characters discuss the location of the Yanivsky concentration camp in the city of Lviv in Western Ukraine. When in the post-Soviet period, when this conversation and one of the novel's narrative strands takes place, very little trace of this camp remains, and very little trace of the camp remains until this day. It had been liquidated by the Germans already during the war, and the territory was then turned into a Soviet prison after the war. The lack of trace at this site, the characters reflect, is not the fault of the local people. And as the protagonist says, Lviv bears no responsibility for this. We were just part of a colony. The colonizers decided everything. Now, it is of course true that in the 46 years after the end of World War II, that Western Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, commemorative culture was strictly dictated from Moscow, which refused to recognize the specific fate of the Jews under Nazi occupation. The memory of the so-called Great Patriotic War, to use the Soviet term for the Second World War, was dominated by the triumph and sacrifice of the denationalized Soviet people, and any competing heroism or particular victimhood was a distraction from this bigger story. And Holocaust commemoration in particular was seen as a sign of cosmopolitanism, covert Zionism, and so on. Now, to the uninitiated, to understand this situation in terms of colonization may seem somewhat surprising, but since the early 1990s, Ukrainian intellectuals have, perhaps more than in any other post-Soviet country, embraced post-colonial discourse to describe the history of the country as one of oppression at the hands of multiple aggressively expansive empires and states, principally, of course, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Russian and Soviet rule in Ukraine certainly did have some seemingly colonial traits. Military conquest, suppression of local language and culture in favor of the culture and language of the center, brutal economic exploitation of human and natural resources manifest first in serfdom under the Tsars and then in collectivization under Stalin. And in the 1990s, Ukrainian historians, writers, intellectuals went about energetically reassessing this history, correcting Russian-Soviet distortions about everything from the medieval princes of Kiev and Rus up to the 1980s dissident movement. Overcoming what Frantz Fanon describes as the immobility of the colonized by replacing the history of colonization with the history of the nation, the history of decolonization. Yuri Vinichuk's novel certainly contributes to this process, and in the sense that it presents the history of Lviv, the Second World War, under Soviet and Nazi occupation in a way that is explicitly designed to debunk Soviet-Russian myths about this period. But also in its contemporary narrative strand, where the quotation I used comes from, it dramatizes the process of post-colonial recovery of memory and the difficulties of this process. A key element of the novel's revival of the novel's kind of anti-colonial aspect is the revival of the myth of the Western Ukrainian anti-Soviet resistance movement, and especially the Ukrainian insurgent army, which was a large fragmented guerrilla movement which fought principally against the Soviets during the Second World War. The Ukrainian insurgent army, or the UPA, was connected to a far-right nationalist political group called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, whose leaders briefly collaborated with the Nazis, although they later fought against them. And Vinichuk's revival of this myth of resistance is very much part of a wider revival of these topics in public memory, especially in Western Ukraine since 1991. Members of these movements participated in German military and police formations in various ways, ostensibly often with the aim of receiving arms and training, but sometimes and controversially, in the process engaging in violence against Jews, but also later in different ways against Poles. The extent to which the nationalists were, for example, involved in the perpetration of the Lviv pogrom of 1941, which is described in key scenes in Vinichuk's novel, continues to spark controversy and debate in Ukraine and beyond it. Vinichuk's novel promotes a distinction between the political organization of Ukrainian nationalists who appear in the novel as fanatical and somewhat ridiculous, and the ordinary rank and file members of the resistance movement of the Ukrainian insurgent army, who are portrayed not only as heroic, but as tolerant. The novel indeed follows 4 friends of different nationalities, a Ukrainian, a Pole, a German, and a Jew, who all come from the city of Lviv, and depicts a somewhat idyllic picture of the coexistence of different nationalities in the cities before and also even during the war. In a somewhat unlikely proposition, the fathers of all 4 of these characters had fought together for the establishment of an independent Ukrainian state after the First World War, and now, during the Second World War, their sons find themselves fighting together for the Ukrainian insurgent army against the Soviets. The story ends with the suicide of the Ukrainian protagonist and his Jewish friend by blowing themselves up with a grenade in order to avoid capture by the NKVD. An ending which we could read either as a gesture of Ukrainian Jewish solidarity, co-victimhood, or perhaps also as an instrumentalization of Jewish suffering in a Ukrainian-centric anti-Soviet stroke anti-colonial narrative. The question of Ukrainian participation in the 1941 pogrom does come up in the novel, but it is somewhat obfuscated. Vinichuk informs us that the atrocity was perpetrated by the local rabble, using the Ukrainian term shumovinya. This word has become a commonplace term in Ukrainian discourse on the pogrom that moves responsibility onto socially marginal elements in the city and absolves conscious nationalists, members of the nationalist movement, of culpability. Vinichuk's rabble is not entirely even condemned, however. It is, in the description, first of all, acting out of uncontrollable fury caused by its own suffering at the hands of the Soviets and the NKVD. And secondly, it is in fact targeting not the local Jews with whom the Ukrainians exist peacefully, but instead the Jews who arrived with the Soviets and participated in the occupation and the terror against local people. The pogrom is thus reframed from being a Nazi crime with local participation to an elemental reaction to Soviet colonial violence. And this kind of narrative is not confined to the work of this one author. In fact, it appears in broader nationalistically inclined memory discourse. One example is at one of Lviv's most important memory sites in terms of the kind of nationalist reading of the past, which is the prison at Lonsky Street Museum, a museum which celebrates Ukrainian anti-Soviet resistance and dissidence. The prison was also, however, a key site in the 1941 pogrom, as it was here that the Nazis displayed the mutilated bodies of Ukrainian and other victims of the NKVD in order to incite hatred against the Jews. Despite the link, the museum ignored the pogrom for a long time, and then later did include the story, but told it using this rhetoric of the uncontrolled urban rabble as the perpetrators, in order to excuse the nationalist organizations which it celebrates. The museum also uses an anti-colonial stance, casting its location as a site of the incarceration of Ukrainians under a succession of what it calls occupying regimes, Polish, Nazi, and Soviet, deliberately blurring the boundaries between state rule and military occupation in a way that is common elsewhere in the region, for example, in the Baltic states. The museum is an important site in the development of Ukraine's contemporary anti-colonial narrative. It is associated with an institution called the Center for the Study of Liberation Struggles, whose one-time director, Volodymyr Wiatrovich, recently served as the head of Ukraine's Institute of National Remembrance, he was appointed after the Maidan protests of 2013 and 14. during which the abusive, corrupt, pro-Russian government of President Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown after Yanukovych tried to renege on a trade agreement with the EU and move Ukraine closer towards closer ties and for many neo-colonial relationships with Russia. And Russia then used these events as a pretext for the annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass. Under Viatrovich, the former director of this institution, which is connected to the museum, the Ukrainian state launched, through the Institute of National Remembrance, a process of decommunization, introducing a set of new laws aimed at cleansing Ukraine's cities of monuments and place names connected to the Soviet Union, but also regulating the use of Soviet symbols in public life, a process which angered Russia, which framed the government in Kiev as the inheritors of Ukraine's supposed fascist collaborationist World War II heritage. Russia also concealed its aggression against Ukraine under the cover of a manufactured local, supposedly local anti-fascist insurgencies, which were in fact a combination of local separatists with Russian separate forces and regular Russian troops and also Russian volunteers. And at home, Russia cranked up its own neo-Soviet victory mythology to underpin its actions in Crimea and Donbass, frequently invoking the USSR's role in defeating fascism, which it saw as being revived in Kiev, and also often invoking the idea that the USSR had intervened to stop the Holocaust. At the same time, Russia also revived older historical myths, including the 18th century concept of Novorossiya, or New Russia, which was the name given to southern and eastern Ukraine when they were first conquered by the Russian Empire. Partially in response to this, the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance under Viatrovich proposed a new policy called decolonization, whereby, as a continuation of decommunization, whereby the names and monuments, some of which had been actually reinstated since 1991, connected to Russian imperial history, would also be removed. A change of government in 2018, however, removed him from his post. However, these policies, these activities show that at the state level in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, the history of World War II, the history, including the history of the Holocaust, are part of what's seen on both sides in different ways as a wider post-colonial or neo-colonial memory struggle. This anti-colonial memory paradigm is not unchallenged in Ukraine, however. In 2017, for example, the Center for Urban History in the city of Lviv, which itself has coordinated numerous Holocaust memorial projects in the city, held an exhibition and series of events curated by the Kiev artist Nikita Kadan, entitled Unnamed. In one of the series of works included in the exhibition, but which had been exhibited previously, Kadan uses well-known photographic images of the Lviv pogrom, including images taken at the Lonsky prison itself, as a basis for a series of stark charcoal drawings or graphics, so watercolor graphics that you can see here. By transforming images, a couple more examples. By transforming the photographic images into drawings, Kadan problematizes the process of witnessing, of documenting atrocity, but also wrenches the images from the manipulated propagandistic cycle in which they are often misused, and distills them down to the kind of visceral acts of violence that are, as it were, spelled out in black and white, with the emphasis on the perpetrator and the acts of violence. In an exhibition that's opening right now in Kiev, these same works are shown next to a painting by the interwar Ukrainian Jewish artist Manuel Shechtman, called Pogrom, from 1926. This curatorial choice, which was made by Kadan himself, instead of manufacturing a convenient fictional Jewish friend and co-martyr, as happens in Vinichuk's novel, places a Jewish artistic voice at the heart of the process of the reckoning with the past. In the same exhibition, Khadan engages with a contemporary pogrom and contemporary questions of ethnic violence and right-wing violence. The sculpture Architekton Matzahra, pictured here, reproduces one of Kazimir Malevich's suprematist architecton sculptures, only turning it into these kind of sterile white forms, and places it alongside a recreated shanty hut of a Roma family, which was burned down by a neo-Nazi mob in Kiev in 2018, an event which is widely referred to in Ukrainian media as a pogrom. This work is one of a series of, and you can see an image from that incident here, and one of the right-wing activists. This work is one of a series that critically engages with the Soviet, by Khadan, which critically engages with the Soviet avant-garde in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian context, and the fraught relationship of these artists to Soviet totalitarianism and violence, which in Ukraine's case, as I mentioned, became, in a sense, colonial, resulting in the planned starvation of millions of Ukrainian peasants. Something which is also obliquely referenced in some of Malevich's works. And Malevich came from and worked in Ukraine. But also resulted in the physical annihilation of a whole generation of these avant-garde artists. In another piece called Victory, Khadan takes Ukrainian Soviet sculptor Vasily Yermilov's unbuilt monument to three revolutions, similarly paints it in this kind of sterile white and juxtaposes it with traces of contemporary colonial violence, wreckage from the Donbass home destroyed during Russia's invasion of that region. Khadan then, like Vinnichuk, approaches the memory of the Holocaust in Ukraine in the context of the country's post-colonial relationship with Russia. Nazi violence and the question of Ukrainian participation in it are part of the same story as Ukraine's historical and contemporary status as the object of violent Russian-Soviet imperial designs. Yet instead of bending the story of the Holocaust in Ukraine towards an anti-colonial narrative, subsuming Jewish victimhood and Jewish voices, as Vinnichuk does, Khadan offers a solution to the same dilemma, the same complicated entanglements that is based less on anti-colonial resistance and more on a post-colonial reflection, self-criticism, and the recognition of the need to take responsibility for the past and its problematic reverberations in the present. I think I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Yes, thanks a lot, William. Yes, for unpacking several aspects of a complex memoryscape such as the Ukrainian one. So we'll have for sure questions to ask you later. We move now to the second speaker, who is Dr. Federica Matzahra from University of Westminster. Federica Matzahra is reader in intercultural communication, and her research interests lie in interdisciplinary fields of migration studies and cultural studies. She has published widely on the literature of migration in Italy, theories of intermediality, and the visual arts as a form of political resistance. She has also created art installation on migration, including Nothing is Missing by Mie Kebal and Sink Without Trace, which took place at the P21 Gallery. The latter, created with artist Maya Ramsey, focuses on the issue of migrant deaths at sea. Federica is also the author of Reframing Migration, Lampedusa, Border Spectacle, and Aesthetics of Subversion. The title of her talk today is going to be Mediating Memory of Migration, the Role of Art and Activism.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I have to say that I'll do my best to cover as much as possible. I was a little bit too ambitious, I'm afraid, when I wrote my abstract, thinking of presenting at least two artworks from Sink Without Trace. But I believe we will be able actually to only address and unpack one of these two. Maybe during the Q&A session, there'll be more time and I can address and consider other artworks of the exhibition. So as Guido said, part of my research revolves around strategies of memorialization in context of migration. And particularly today, I want to focus on the issue of death at sea, being this a quite crucial aspect of my recent research and my curatorial experience in 2019. So for at least the past 3 decades, migrants crossing the sea via unauthorized routes, this is what I am particularly looking at, have been, as you know, victims of shipwrecks in one of the most recent human relocation, where Europe, in this specific case, is their desired destination. So today, people, us, watching news, reporting on migrant death at sea, have become pretty much desensitized towards what should be an unavoidable daily human loss. However, the increasing enforcement of EU borders has seen member countries making agreements with third countries, a so-called externalization of borders, with countries that include Libya or Turkey, to handle what, from the perspective of Europe, is defined as an unmanageable mass migration and refugee crisis. Now, these drastic measures carried out without first assessing the human rights standards in those places have, of course, inevitably intensified the risk of death and have certainly not prevented the loss at sea. Actually, people are dying every day and they are still dying. Now, to add to this already pretty dreadful situation, the lack of regulations that are related to the recovery and consequently, of course, to the identification of migrant corpses has turned the Mediterranean and, of course, the Aegean Sea as well into pretty much graveyards for thousands of nameless and unclaimed bodies of water. Data on the victims of the illegalized journeys available to the general public is largely sourced from news media, which of course raises doubt about the reliability, while there are no official death tolls. So the situation is very, very complicated. Now, within this frame of vulnerability, victims of shipwrecks of unauthorized journeys can be said to fall under the category of ungrievable lives. That's my next slide. Where the term, of course, by Judith Butler, which refers to lives that cannot be lost, cannot be destroyed, because they already inhabit a lost and destroyed zone. So they are ontologically and from the start already lost and destroyed. And even the strategy of the burial of recovered bodies adopted in places that receive the corpses of shipwrecks victims corroborate the fact that grieving the migrant lost lives is not actually recognized or respected practice. Rightly, are these corpses allowed a coffin, for instance? And if they are, it is often in response to a strategy of spectacularization that revolve, for instance, around events that require pretty opportunistic humanitarian parade from the institution. Just to give you an example, the 3rd of October 2013, the shipwreck off the coast of Lampedusa, which caused the death of at least 368 Eritreans. On that occasion, there was a state funeral to which survivors were not admitted, and it was arranged on the island in order to simply allow for a parade of governmental representatives. In such cases, it's clear that the dead are instrumentalized for political purposes to justify policies of repression, border militarization, which are, of course, sold as humanitarian missions. There are lots of other cases and examples I could make. Bodies of water, in fact, do not usually end up in coffins, not at all. They are certainly not offered state funerals. This is not the common practice. Plastic bags are the most common destination of these ungrievable and untraceable bodies, while numbers are used to identify them when they are interred in unmarked mass graves. Those who are never recovered are, of course, left to decompose at the bottom of the sea. Now, the way migrant loss at sea is managed by the violent European border regime responds to what Achille Mbembe has defined as the necropolitical condition and, I quote, the subjugation of migrant life to the power of death. In other words, sovereignty is perceived as a way to exercise the right to kill. which must be considered as part of the strategy of subjugation that, of course, results from more than 500 years of empire, colonial conquest, and slavery. Is all connected. So what we are witnessing here is simply a new declination of an old and repressed issue. So the necropolitical approach is generally supported and justified by the reiteration of the above-mentioned patterns, of course, of political and juridical discourse, which are, of course, fueled by the other mainstream discourse, the mainstream media that participate, for instance, to the enticing fabrication of what geographer Nicholas de Genovese defined as the border spectacle, where migrant bodies are totally individualized as human beings and pretty much treated mostly as a threat. So death is in fact presented as a kind of regular feature of illegalized migration, a better term, an alternative term to illegal is illegalized migration that points at the process of making migration illegal. So it is very much now a naturalized phenomenon that has become pretty much acceptable, bearable, because portrayed as a kind of ineluctable consequence of the impossibility of coping with what is as usually described as an unimaginable crisis. Now, given the reiteration of the above strategies that is causing the death of many, I believe it is crucial to find alternative ways to engage with this phenomenon, to look and to talk about the current phenomenon of human relocation. Migrant death at sea can be definitely addressed within a politics of dissensus or subversion that goes beyond compassion, that goes beyond criminalization, and that goes beyond fetishization of the other. And where effective identification is not necessarily the desired response. Now, I found that artistic responses to migrant death at sea have the potential to produce an important and very radical alternative to the necropolitical condition, because they can engage in acts of contestations of those practices that tend to conceal the violence of borders. So, of course, a starting point and a kind of premise here is the conviction that artistic engagement are increasingly developing spaces for subversive practices. So I will here refer to the exhibition Sink Without Trace that I co-curated with London-based artist Maya Ramsey, that has brought together artists with different backgrounds, with a shared interest of responding to and problematizing the pressing issue of migrant death at sea. This is an exhibition that took place at the P21 Gallery in London. This was between June and July in 2019, 13 June, 13 of July 2019. The artwork from Sink Without Trace that I will analyze in the context of this presentation is certainly what I consider an example of dissensus and subversion in art as explored in the context of this study. It is the artwork by Maya Ramsey, Countless, which addresses the practices of recovering and identification of bodies and the consequent burial and grievability, or actually the lack of, that can make viewer more aware and as a result more prone to engage in a critical reading of both acts of criminalization of migration and also of the so-called sentimental politics, to refer to the sort of idea of the affective reaction. Just a few more things about the exhibition before I share with you the webpage of Maya's Countless work. The exhibition was the result of 5 years of research, and one of the main outcomes was, of course, also the monograph that Guido presented, the book I wrote called Reframing Migration, that sort of sets the theoretical framework. In the book, I explore the activist art forms that have become a platform for subverting the dominant narrative of migration, and together with activism, I then explore several artworks and visual artworks that have responded to the issue of not only death at sea, but to other aspects of the of the migration phenomenon. Alongside the theoretical approach that I developed, Maya Ramsey conducted some fieldwork in Sicily for the project Countless, which includes a series of graphite rubbings from the graves of 30 migrants who died at sea while trying to reach Europe, and were now buried in random Sicilian cemetery. Now, because before I move on, I would like to share with you the page. Let me see if I can do this smoothly. So I will stop this and I will share. Sorry about that. Okay. Screen. I probably need to share the screen, I'm afraid. Okay. So by sharing the screen, can you see this? Can you see the Maya Ramsey page? Good. Okay, so these are some of the pictures from Countless. You can see that it's a mixture of grabbings and a mixture of photographs taken in the Sicilian cemeteries. And while you can also take a look at the way she basically conducted this practice of rubbing. So while I leave these on, and I will continue my talk. Oh no, now I can't do this because I can't see my notes. Okay, I'll just give a few minutes to show you how Maya worked. So this is in Palermo. And she's taking basically a rubbing using thin paper of one of these crosses that are there to mark the presence of anonymous migrant corpses and bodies. So most of them are nameless, and that's how it worked. So the result is a series of rubbings that look like this. So this says persona sconosciuta di sesso maschile, unknown person, male, date, which is potentially the date of birth. Some data is available, some others is pretty much non-existent, and numbers. Numbers are always there. There's always a number on the stone, on the grave. Okay, let me stop sharing this and I'll get back to my slide. Sorry about this. And this, I leave you with a slide of some of the pictures from the exhibition while I talk. Sorry, we'll leave it like this. Okay. So Countless is a sort of two-part project. The first part comprises these 30 graphite wrappings from the graves of unnamed migrants who lost their lives in the Sicilian Channel, highlighting the fact that it was 30 years since the first recorded migrant shipwreck in European waters. So again, that's a pretty important point, because Maya is addressing the fact that there's nothing new in this phenomenon, that the first people losing their life in the Sicilian Channel actually go back to the late 80s. So again, is a good way to point the fact that there is an history, of course. The second part includes wrappings of the names painted on the sides of migrant fishing boats, which were abandoned in Porto Paolo, a place in Sicily, before eventually being destroyed by the authorities. Now, the grave rubbings are on tissue paper, as I show you, framed in perspex, as if to emulate almost a dignified marble headstone that sadly so few of them have. And one of the 200 migrant graves that Maya visited, only 2 out of 200, only 2 have been identified, and less than 10 had a headstone. The rubbings are exhibited within Sync Without Trace, alongside photographic images and video footage of the graves, boats, and further information on the subject. Now, the Countlets project continues with a study also of objects that were collected from the boatyard in Portopalo, and they were also included in the exhibition with the title Leave or Remain. In Countless, Maya Ramsey applies a strategy of memorialization in a migratory context. Once again, the necropolitical space targeted in this work in Sicily and its cemeteries, where most of the corpses recovered from the shipwreck happened. Within the context of the recent migratory crossings, the sea victims, if recovered at all, become victims yet again, this time of the negligent system that is supposed to manage the identification and burial of the bodies, but it usually doesn't happen. So in Sicily, for instance, there is no norm or law that regulates the identification and burial of victims of sea, and to complicate the traceability of this body even further, there is no official registry kept on the island to record the death or the personal details. Absolutely nothing is there to allow this identification or to archive this information. So the system of recording that is in place pretty much random and lacks standardization. So as a result, the inscribe on the graves is itself pretty vague. Guido, how long have I left?
Perhaps you could go on for two minutes?
2 more minutes, okay. Okay. There are cases, however, when the local municipality makes the effort to secure identified burial for these unknown deaths. So these are considered sort of spontaneous acts of memorializing, from which, of course, the families of the identified victims are usually excluded for obvious reasons. They're not permitted to travel, for instance, from the home countries, but at least this sort of try to compensate for the inefficacy of the state system. These practices of marking spontaneous mourning are indeed aimed at counterbalancing the necropolitical strategy of the deletion of migrant life and death. Just to conclude, I would like to say that, final remarks, I'm trying to. So the difficulty of even reaching some of the graves due to their elevated location that, of course, Maya Ramsey experienced, excludes the prospect of performing any act of grieving, making clear that deaf migrants remain at the margin. So there's not actually a reason to access these graves because there's no reason to grieve these people. So Maya's Ramsey's approach to memorialization intends to subvert that marginality by using a strategy of remembrance that provocatively almost recalls the one practice around war memorials, such as the US Vietnam Veterans Memorial, where visitors copy by rubbing the name of a family member of a friend who died during the Vietnam War. Such rubbings also, of course, function as personal souvenirs commemorating a visit. In a way, these rubbings become protectors of a very uncomfortable memory for those in a hegemonic position of power. So Countless managed to breach a representational order that prioritized the anonymity and invisibility of migrants. So what does become visible in Maya Ramsey's act of political memorialization is the subversion of the incontestable narrative of the policy, with everlasting impressions of a colonial margin that is otherwise designed to be forgotten, a margin inevitably inhabited by migrants living or dead. I will stop here and thank you for listening, and I'm happy to expand on any point or making more reference to the exhibition.
Yes, thanks a lot, Federica. I mean, yes, and above all for addressing, I mean, such an important, I mean, issue, I mean, of our contemporary time. And indeed, I mean, we will continue the discussion in a few moments. So let me now just introduce the third speaker, and who is Professor Damien Short. Unfortunately, Professor Damien Short is not able to attend this virtual event in person because he was called away by another duty of his university, but he sent a recording of his speech, which we are going to share soon. And it's possible that Professor Short actually will be able to join us for the Q&A. So if you would then have questions addressed to him, please write them in the chat, because maybe in the last, later he will be able to join, or in case we will pass also the question on him. So just to introduce him, Professor Short is co-director of the Human Rights Consortium and Professor of Human Rights and Environmental Justice at the School of Advanced Studies in London. He has spent his professional career working in the field of human rights and environmental justice, both as a scholar and advocate. He has researched and published extensively in the areas of indigenous people's rights, genocide studies, reconciliation project, and environmental human rights. So the title of his talk today is Culture, Genocide, and Injustice in Australia.
Hello, I'm Damien Short, and today I'll be talking about genocide, denial, and Indigenous memory in Australia. Apologies for not being there virtually in person, but hopefully this recording will suffice. Much of the material I'll be discussing today you can find on my website, just damienshort.org, and contained in these two books here. Reconciliation and Colonial Power, Indigenous Rights in Australia, which was an Ashgate and now Routledge publication, and then Redefining Genocide, Settler Colonialism, Social Death and Ecocide, which was published by Z Books back in 2016. There's a chapter on Australia in there. What I would like to do today is to focus on the last two of the key genocidal periods in Australian history that you can see listed there. But, you know, suffice it to say that those four are the main sort of periods within Australian history that have attracted the interest of genocide scholars and Indigenous scholars more recently, looking at the potential for continuing dispossession of land to be considered genocidal. All the references, as I say, are available in those two books, and in a reference I will give you at the end. So back when the Genocide Convention and ratification debates were taking place in Australia in 1949, you had this sort of sentiment expressed. No one in his right senses believes that the Commonwealth of Australia will be called before the bar of public opinion, if there is such a thing, and asked to answer for any of the things which are enumerated in this convention. The horrible crime of genocide is unthinkable in Australia. That we detest all forms of genocide arises from the fact that we are a moral people. And yet, from the late 1920s and early 1930s, Australian policymakers, usually consisting of eminent anthropologists, medical scientists, publicists, and like-minded politicians, began to develop a policy based on eugenics designed to solve what was then called, quote, the half-caste problem. The policy was designed to, again, quote, breed out the colour. Subsequently, it became known as the policy of biological assimilation and absorption and social integration, etc. And it lasted until the 1970s in that form, in the later form, that is. The rather infamous picture featured in the film Rabbit Proof Fence and led to lots of discussion and the so-called history wars in Australia after a report I shall just look at in a minute was released as well. But this infamous picture is demonstrating how the colour, in fact, can be bred out from right to left over the course of 3 generations. Now, somewhat amazingly, despite how long this practice of child removal was going on, it took until 1997 for a major investigative report to be released that documented the human rights violations of this period. And that was 1997's Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission report, Bringing Them Home, a now rather infamous report in Australia, in Australian discussions around this topic. The report contained harrowing evidence finding that the forcible removal of Indigenous children was in fact a gross violation of human rights that continued well after Australia had undertaken such international human rights commitments. The report concluded that the removal constituted an act of genocide contrary to the Convention on Genocide. In particular, the category of forcibly transferring children of a group to another group with the intent of destroying the group, using that intention to, quote, breed out the colour as primary evidence. It was racially discriminatory because it only applied to Aboriginal children on that scale. Now, since then, there was an awful lot of discussion, quite heated debates about whether genocide was an appropriate term to use in this context, and these are some of the examples of those who thought it was not. Kenneth Minogue says, Indigenous peoples in their more extreme moments have a weakness for dramatizing their sufferings by invoking the idea of genocide, which he describes as exploiting a prefabricated emotional charge. Similarly, Ron Brunton described the accusation of genocide as rhetorical misuse by political activists and others indifferent to the importance of proper hierarchies of wrongdoing, attracted to genocide status as the ultimate evil. On the opposite side of the discussion, you had Aboriginal writer Larissa Behrendt, among many, I should say, who argued that despite the demise of the cultural method, and I'll talk about that in a few slides' time, the cultural method of genocide, which the coiner of the term had as a central element of genocide in his understanding, that's Raphael Lemkin, and we'll come on to him in a moment. Despite this demise of the cultural method in the construction of the UN Genocide Convention, it had done nothing, she says, to dispel the feeling that Indigenous peoples have that this, i.e. genocide, is the correct word and a word that adequately describes our experience, she says, as colonized peoples. Now, to gain some conceptual clarity on this, and this is one of the things that really interested me in this field, was to look at the writings of the chap who originated the term genocide and to see exactly who's right here. Does his understanding fit more with the Ron Bruntons and the Kenneth Minogues, or does it fit more with the use by Indigenous peoples of the word genocide? Well, Lemkin emphasised two major methods of genocide and a distinct colonial dimension: killing members of the group, i.e. physical genocide, and undermining the group's way of life, the cultural method of genocide. In Lemkin's words, genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This imposition, in turn, may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain, or upon the territory alone after the removal of the population and the colonization of the area by the oppressor's own nationals. During the process of the construction of the draft convention, Lemkin suggested that, and this is quite surprising to a lot of people who think that genocide is simply about mass killing, cultural genocide, he said, is the most important part of the convention. And that's because culture animates the genos in genocide for him. But reluctantly, it was approved that the eventual passage of the convention would have to go ahead without the cultural method. In Lemkin's 1958 autobiography, he said, I defended it successfully through two drafts. It meant the destruction of the cultural pattern of a group, such as the language, the traditions, the monuments, archives, libraries, churches. In brief, he said, the shrines of the soul of a nation. But there was not enough support for this idea in the committee, so with a heavy heart, I decided not to press for it. Lemkin had to drop an idea that, in his words, was very dear to me. Now, inspired by Lemkin's work, we've had a number of important philosophical interventions by Claudia Card in 2003 and Mohammed Abed in 2006. And what they did was to focus on a central element of Lemkin's thinking, social death, and not mass killing as such. It allows us to distinguish the peculiar evil of genocide in the Lemkinian sense from crimes against humanity that focuses more on civilians. In Claudia Card's analysis, genocidal murders are but an extreme means to achieve social death. Moreover, such social death could be produced, of course, without a specific intent to destroy, unlike in the convention, but could occur through sporadic and uncoordinated action or be a byproduct of an incompatible expansionist economic system. They might even result from attempts to do good, to enlighten, to modernize, to evangelize. In keeping with this way of looking at it, a more structural understanding of genocide began to emerge. Now, Tony Barter's famous intervention in this really incorporates an understanding of genocide that can be more relational. He argues that the violence that accompanied the original huge land grab was on a scale and ruthlessness largely unchecked by the colonial authorities, which left little doubt in the minds of either the perpetrators or victims, he said, as to the fate of those who resisted this inevitable course of events. And it can be no coincidence that it was accompanied, among those with no thought of murder on their minds, by such talk about the inevitable dying out of the indigenous peoples. It's not too simplistic, he said, to see in this dominant opinion the most comfortable ideological reflection of a relationship which could only be recognized in good conscience for what it was, a relationship of genocide. At the heart of these relations of genocide, then as now, is land, or land is life, as the late Patrick Wolfe put it. Land is life, he said, or at least land is necessary for life, and contests for land can be, indeed, often are, contests for life. The primary motive for elimination is, he said, not race or religion or ethnicity, but access to territory. In Wolfe's terms, territoriality is settler colonialism's irreducible element. As Barbara Bird Rose put it, I should say, to get in the way of settler colonization, she said, all the native has to do is to stay at home. Thus, you can see in an indigenous understanding how centrally important land can be, and how dispossession of land and continuing structures of dispossession may well factor into their thinking when describing their experiences of dispossession as genocidal. Now, before a very, very famous case now, the Mabo case, in Australia, we have a situation, unlike in Canada, where there were no treaties signed with Indigenous peoples. There were treaties signed with Indigenous peoples in Canada and in the US. In Australia, that didn't happen. And terra nullius, the concept, as we see here, of an empty land, I see no natives, stood as a founding principle of Australian settlement until the 3rd of June 1992, when the High Court in Mabo argued that the doctrine of terra nullius was a legal fiction based on, quote, little more than bare assertion. However, after that Mabo case, there was a considerable propaganda campaign by mining companies and by the farming lobby for the government to enact legislation which set out points of clarity, as they argued, and gave industry a certain degree of certainty. There was the argument that the Mabo case produced uncertainty for industry. And actually what ended up happening was that you had a land rights regime which had a significant limiting ceiling, as it were, on Indigenous aspirations regarding land. Importantly, the right of veto over future development on proven native title land was a key Indigenous demand after the Mabo case. Simply because land rights without a meaningful right of veto over development are in fact largely meaningless. But the legislation that followed the Mabo case, the Native Title Act's primary purpose was in fact the confirmation and validation of existing commercial titles, and the provision of guarantees that future land negotiations would be conducted within the parameters set by existing power inequalities. The Prime Minister at the time stated that Aboriginal people understood that a generalised veto was never on, he said, and there was some doubt that they even deserved the right of consultation and negotiation over what was done on their land going forward. Quite astonishing, actually, and I write a lot about this in that first book that I mentioned, Reconciliation and Colonial Power. What it basically shone a light on is the emerging Indigenous rights international legal perspectives were quite contrary to what was happening in Australia at the time. The UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was emphasising these three elements that would produce a decolonised relationship between Indigenous peoples and settler states in particular. And that was emphasis on these three things: free, prior and informed consent. In other words, if you withdraw your consent, it's an effective veto. Land rights, and then self-determination. Now, ongoing relations of genocide can be measured empirically, observing the social life of these rights, I've argued. And it's not just in Australia these important issues are discussed in a decolonizing, in an attempt, I should say, to construct a decolonizing discourse. And Mohawk scholar Tyagi Alfred argues that rights like we saw in Australia, the native title regime, in other words, settler state granted and managed rights, should be viewed as part of an ongoing colonial relationship and not a remedy to it. Such rights, he argues, are inevitably and invariably controlled and regulated by the settler state itself. And therefore, Tyagi Alfred questions their remedial quality. He says defining Aboriginal rights in terms of, for example, a right to fish for food or traditional purposes is better than nothing. But to what extent does that state-regulated right to food fish represent justice for people who've been fishing on their rivers and seas since time began? To frame the struggle to achieve justice in terms of Indigenous, quote, claims against the state implicitly accepts the fiction of legitimate settler state sovereignty and the colonial reality. Now, these arguments are taken up in this latest book chapter I've written with Martin Crook as well. And we've looked at what's happened since the Native Title Act and then the Native Title Amendment Act, the continuing dispossession of Indigenous peoples. And we argue that even though direct physical killing and child removals may have officially ended, many Indigenous peoples argue that genocide is in fact a continuing process in Australia. The contention then is predicated on a victim's understanding of cultural genocide and the centrality of land to Indigenous peoples as peoples. We argue then that to break the colonial relationship, treaties, and they are necessarily international treaties with Indigenous peoples being looked at as nations in and of themselves, are needed to grant meaningful land rights and the political rights to self-determination and recognition of sovereignty. And to today, this has not happened. So the central overarching argument then is, in many respects, Indigenous understandings of genocide as a continuing process in settler states like Australia is much more in keeping with the original Lemkinian understanding of genocide. And if you want to read more about that, as I said, there is the reference to the latest paper back in 2019. And the other arguments are featured in papers on my website and in those two books. So thank you for listening, and any questions, if you can post them in the chat on the Zoom, the chat function on the Zoom call, then I will try and answer those as best I can. Thank you.
Okay, yes, this works fine. So we thank them short for having sent the video, and we'll see if he is actually going to be able to take part in a conversation. So we have almost 30 minutes. So this gives us decent time, to address the speakers, and discuss the themes that have been raised. So I'm going to kind of break the ice, by asking a first question, to both the speakers that can kind of address some of the main issues, that we try to consider through this seminar series. But please, use, as I said, you can always raise your hand and come in, or you can use the chat. And Joe Ford is here, to monitor the chat and also moderate, the Q&A by the chat. So you can start to reflect and write down your questions. So what I would like to ask to begin with the conversation, is that we all know as scholars of memory, and then this is also something that emerged quite well from your papers, that the discourse on the past, so what often, then we refer all in the terminology of memory. So the narratives that circulate are the results and are constructed by various type of agents. So we can think about activists, we can think about politicians, and so there is all a sector of this, the policy of memory for we have often sometimes positive and in other cases quite negative effects. And then, I mean, what this seminar tries to focus on, there is also the culture overall and the arts that are entangled in the process. So in a way, you know, if we are here working on literature, cinema, we kind of all believe, I mean, that the arts are important, I mean, in this process. So I would like to ask you, I mean, to according to you, I mean, what is, you know, the specific power that arts has in addressing the past? And so if it can a bit, I mean, as Federica was suggesting, you know, giving this subversive energy through which we can think, you know, about the past in more complex and different ways. But since in a way we are all a bit on the side of the arts, probably, I also would like to ask you, what are the limits, according to you, of the role, you know, that arts in all its various forms can have in framing the narrative about the past?
Shall I go first?
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I think when discussing sort of questions of cultural memory, the question of agency and agents is really important. You know, who is producing these memories and that we're talking about. And in terms of the arts, this is something that I looked at quite a lot in my book, where I looked at the sort of the production of cultural memory in an urban context, and who are the people who produce that memory, and what are the media through which it's produced. And that can be, like you said, sort of through the work of, you know, local councils or politicians who will engage in, you know, the initiation of monuments or memorials or things like that. It can be through popular culture. It can be through consumer culture. It can be through tourism, things like that. But it can also be through how artists, writers operate as agents of memory within a certain urban context. That could be for example, in the case of Yuri Vinichuk, you know, a very well-known local novelist who is very popular in the city and in Ukraine more generally, and very well known as a media commentator, as somebody who participates in festivals, as somebody who will give talks, for example, in museums, who may be engaging in different projects sponsored, for example, by the city council, which he was, you know, in relation to sort of various commemorative initiatives. So on the one hand, you have his works, his novels, which produced a certain kind of representation of the past, which is influential because it has a local audience and also a national audience. But we also have an artist who is engaged as an actor within kind of social and political circles. And the same, I would say, with Nikita Kadan. You know, we have an artist who is able to engage with various different kinds of institutions. In the case of Kadan, what is interesting is his ability to also represent Ukraine outside of Ukraine. So I would say that the contrast between the two of them is that one is kind of designed a bit more for internal use, whereas Nikita Kadan, because he's producing this more kind of a critical narrative, which is maybe more something familiar to what we might see in the way that visual arts engages with these topics in more generally in Europe and Western Europe. He also performs this kind of cultural diplomatic function, I would say, as well. You know, so that's also very important. Yeah, so it's a complicated picture, but I think, you know, the arts and artists function more than just as representations or producers of representations, but they operate within the creation of cultural memory in all kinds of different ways.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for the question, and I absolutely agree with William. And all I can say is that, of course, the way I see is that art operates within the social, not beyond or aside of it. And not only that, but it also uses the same means of other discourses. But what art can do is to add a sort of perceptual shock, to talk, in Jacques Rancière's term, making something is commonly hidden, concealed, visible. So it's about opening up possible visibility of the situation, of events, people, and then to, as Mikebal would say with that term migratory aesthetics, that I think works very well, you leave it to the viewer or the reader to enact that visibility. Is a kind of answering a call by seeing and engaging with the work of art. What ideally should come with this engagement is a mobilization of the individual. So, for instance, I believe that whenever you are willing to engage in art practices, you need to sort of link somehow this project with something that as an impact, so that you can sort of take action, you can sort of mobilize the individual. For instance, in the case of the exhibition I co-curated, Sync Without Trace, we were of course gathering the usual questionnaire at the end, and then we were talking about Alarm Phone, which is an organization, is a hotline basically run by volunteers all around the world, and we were raising fundings for Alarm Phone, so selling the catalogs and raising. But by doing that, we were also raising awareness and making people aware that there was such a thing like Alarm Phone, which is actually rescuing people in distress at sea, not rescuing, but facilitating their governmental rescue. So it's getting the calls from the migrants in distress. And so it's just simply revealing all sorts of layers that are regularly kept hidden for political interest, of course. So there's plenty that art can do, absolutely plenty. Limitations, lots of limitations, of course, especially if you work with institutional spaces. So if you work with museums, I mean, I tell you, it was so hard to find a space where to display artworks that would deal with such a pressing issue, but from a perspective that tends to subvert the discourse. It was really hard. We were at very prestigious places, people considering strongly to embrace the project, but then all sorts of other complications like fundings and things like that. So plenty of limitation, but also the limitation that comes with the space itself. So the fact that you are going to see an exhibition on this topic, if you are already somehow interested, and maybe you already are a pro-migration person, so you go and see the exhibition. So what can really work in terms of subversion is to use public spaces, and spaces that are actually, where people just, walk and they stop and look at things. And we did that within Sync Without Trace, because we took one fishing boat which was used by migrants to cross the Sicilian Channel in the early 2000s, which was used by an artist who took this boat from Lampedusa, and she undertook a solo voyage from Lampedusa to London through all the channels via, France and Netherlands and so on and so forth. And then she took this boat and she exhibited at the King's Cross, the green steps at King's Cross. And that wasn't a sort of like a museum space. It was a public space. So people were just looking at this boat and saying, what is that? So they were coming closer, asking the artist. Some had really harsh reactions. They were like, oh, they should all die. Why are you bringing this to us? But again, that's a pretty strong initiative, and that tries to challenge the limitations you're talking about.
Which for sure can enlarge, the debate, the public,
at least,
can be reached at least somehow.
At least to add, yeah.
So, Joe, I think if you want to come in, I think I saw that there were some questions coming in the chat. So,
sure, yeah, that's great. Yeah, we've got a few questions in the chat. So, just a question for all speakers. First, from Emily Rose. I don't know if you wanted to come and ask your question, Emily Rose. If not, I'm very happy to read it out on your behalf. So, I'll read Emily's question. What do the speakers feel are the limits of decolonization as a memorial frame? You both referred to to that at some point in your talk. So perhaps Willem first, and then Federica.
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think that the sort of use of the post-colonial discourse and the sort of discourse of decolonization, it opens up possibilities, and it brings with it certain problematic elements as well. I mean, one thing that I sort of wanted to talk about, but kind of cut out for reasons of time, was the question of agency, which is raised in that that first quote that I used. So the idea that the fact that the Holocaust is not well commemorated in the site that's been described in the novel, well, this is not our fault because this is all the fault of the colonizer. And this kind of question of agency and also responsibility, I suppose, which comes with responsibility, you know, to come back to the theme of the seminar series, is really at the heart of a lot of the dilemmas in sort of this process of decolonization. You know, looking at, for example, Atto Quayson, for example, writes about the question of agency being absolutely essential to the processes of moving to a post-colonial phase, the kind of taking responsibility for the past, rather than seeing the collective as purely a victim and purely passive. And I think that there's a certain tension you can see in the way that this is presented in this particular novel, because there's, when it is convenient to represent national agency, it's represented, and when it's convenient to remove that, that can also be done. And you know, sort of the status of the colonized being the colonized allows one to do that. And I think you see that in a lot of cases. You know, it's been really interested to really this question of agency and that whole discourse of decolonization is so complicated. You know, even looking at the recent sort of discussions in the UK about this, and I've been following very, very closely how this has been playing out in Scotland, and Scotland has its own kind of specific angle on this. And there's a certain, school of thought within Scotland which says, well, you know, the Scots themselves had nothing to do with all of this colonization, which was all done from London, and we ourselves are kind of the co-victims. And it's sort of it allows you know, that's to see the national collective again as by sort of selectively using agency, it allows you to position the national collective in a certain way. But it's kind of manipulative. It's kind of, I think it's either it has to be embraced, or it has to be I don't think that this kind of selective use of invocation of agency is kind of problematic, I think, and you see it in the Ukrainian case and in many other cases. So I think that's perhaps one of the limitations of that discourse of decolonization.
Thank you very much, William. Federica?
Yeah, I mean, just to link to what William is saying in terms of ad agency, I think this is a crucial term that should be definitely considered. And also, of course, decolonization. What is decolonization? And we are pretty much stuck in the same kind of patterns, and we're still struggling with the idea of decolonizing our minds. I mean, the reason why we're still talking about issues such as death at sea and marginality or ungrivability of lives is because we are still absolutely completely stuck in the same sort of pattern of so it's very much a neo-colonial approach. But in terms of agency, I believe this is the key. That's the thing. When you look at issues of this kind, and of course I'm now referring back to my specific topic. One thing that should inform the new discourse, and one thing that should hijack the narrative, is agency, and is looking at the agency of these people, and is looking at their actions in a a completely new way. So it's looking at this action and looking at the self-determination of these people, at their agency, and valuing their action. So not looking at the action of escape as a kind of irresponsible thing happening, but as a incredibly brave and powerful moment of decision, of agency. So yeah, it's a matter of developing a completely different gaze that could help the process of decolonization that I'm afraid isn't fully happened yet. And sorry, there is some a reference to, there was something on the chat by, I can't see now, on, is it Elizabeth? I think, just quickly want to answer to this question. If I've looked at similar work with the migrants in other areas like Central America, Mexico, United States, not in my writing, but I do a lot of teaching around this thing. So I know and I'm aware of there's an important production in several different geopolitical areas, and definitely the US, Mexico is a very, very interesting in terms of course, generating a lot of artistic and activist response, but not, I can't tell you I'm doing this in my writing out there and say, oh, Elizabeth, you're there. Okay, sorry.
Thanks very much, Federica. So there are a few more questions in the chat. I mean, there's a couple here for Willem. So there's one from Ep. I don't know if Ep, you are available to ask your question. Would you like to come on?
Yes, yeah. I can ask my question. First of all, thank you for the organizers and thank you to all the presenters. It was really wonderful. So question to William, I thought it was really interesting how you started with anti-colonial and then you moved to post-colonial. So, but of course you had just like a couple of examples, but do you think it's a more general change in Ukrainian culture? Would you say that this is a change in cultural dominant? And if it is, then can you locate when exactly, of course, or not exactly, but when in general terms it happened? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question as well. I mean, the kind of shift from the anti-colonial to the post-colonial, and you know, and the idea that this could happen or should happen, that's something that scholars who have written about this in the Ukrainian context have spoken about, you know, before me, and I'm kind of drawing on them in that sense. People, maybe names unfamiliar to people, but Marko Pavlish and Vitaly Chernetsky, and drawing on post-colonial, the idea of the, you know, there being an anti-colonial sort of negative resistance mode and a more reflective, self-critical post-colonial mode. It's something that you find in the theory. And I think it's, again, I think, you know, Atto Kwesin I mentioned already, but he also describes this, I think, in a very useful way, and in that these impulses always kind of coexist simultaneously. So that it's kind of hard to identify a movement from one to the other, but there's this kind of sliding scale between them, or that they kind of exist in parallel. And I would say that characterizes what I see in Ukraine. I mean, the kind of self-consciously post-colonial discourse, or the kind of use of the language of post-colonial theory comes in, you know, probably in the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, with, you know, the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union and this lifting of, I suppose, information embargo, and Ukrainian intellectuals and writers have access to these theories and start to apply them to the case of Ukraine. And even that in itself, you know, doing that in itself is a gesture, which kind of, it's a gesture of, you know, belonging to sort of global intellectual processes, which itself is kind of a post-colonial gesture. You know, it's kind of, we're coming out of that kind of immobility that Fanon describes, and taking control of how we understand ourselves, and just engaging with post-colonialism is one way of doing that in and of itself. And probably, yeah, there is a move. You probably sort of saw a move away from the more resistance mode towards a more kind of reflective, often ironic and playful mode. But it's interesting what's happening now, because now we have obviously direct aggression of Russia against Ukraine. You have Russia annexing parts of Ukraine again, and it feels very much like this this kind of colonial situation has become live again, and it's and people are losing their lives because of it. I wouldn't say that it has particularly caused a kind of roll back towards the anti-colonial in culture, but maybe in certain areas of public discourse, it has. And I think you saw the way that it came up in the wake of the decommunization policies, the fact that this started to turn into decolonization. The fact that it wasn't enough to kind of erase the Soviet layer, we had to go deeper and erase the colonial layer that's underneath that as well. And that was probably a response to what happened more recently. That was a kind of long-winded way of saying I think that both of them kind of still coexist, and it kind of goes back and forth between those two trends.
Thanks very much for your question, Eb. Thanks, Willem. There's another question for you, Willem, about Caden's work and the reception in Ukraine.
So I mean, it's kind of an interesting question, because he would probably be sort of someone who would be a bit controversial maybe for the mainstream, because he's very kind of critical of the national narrative. He's not a kind of particularly patriotic person in any way, and many would see the way that he engages with these kind of self-critical approach, making a work of art which shows the far right attack on the Roma, for example. He would be kind of put into that sort of left-wing kind of critical progressive camp, which is something which is in kind of general political public discourse in Ukraine quite marginal. However, in terms of the Ukrainian art scene as such, he is certainly a big name. He's one of the most prominent names. He is exhibited in good galleries, but they tend to be maybe the more, again, you'd say sort of trendy galleries, the ones that have kind of connections with foreign funding, for example. He has exhibited outside of Ukraine quite a lot, possibly more than any other contemporary Ukrainian artist. I can't say that for sure, but he certainly would be one of the most widely exhibited outside of Ukraine. And, so within certain circles in Ukraine, he would be considered a sort of a well-known and quite prominent figure, but in kind of larger public discourse, he would be, I think, considered quite marginal, and would probably be, his type of approach would upset certainly a lot of people. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that there is a question in the chat for Damien, but I can't see him in the call. So what I might do is just make sure that those questions are passed on to him, and perhaps we can be in touch afterwards. Do you think, Guido?
Yes, I think we can pass the question to Damien later. So I'm aware of time, so we are really close to the end. Just also, I know some speakers have to leave on the dot. But so just to conclude, I mean, to Federica, I mean, since you mentioned that you did not have the time to refer to everything you want to speak about, just, I mean, if in 30 seconds, I mean, you could expand, I mean, on the.
Well, yes. I mean, what I can say about I don't know if any of you had a chance to actually visit the Sing Without Trace exhibition, but there is a website which is still working, is still on, and you can find lots of information about the exhibition. I'll write it on the chat. It's www.singwithouttrace.com. What I can say about this very, very quickly is that we were really surprised to see about the response. So there was an incredible media coverage. There were interviews from, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, Financial Times. There are newspaper. It was massive. But the reason why this happened, and this I think explains so many things, is because exactly at the same time there was the Venice Biennale. And as part of Venice Biennale, there was the exhibition at the Arsenale, which is the harbor part of Venice, of one of the boats that was part of a shipwreck in 2018, where up to 1,000 people died, very close to Lampedusa, and where 458 bodies were recovered a year after from the belly of the boat. And this was a project of an Icelandic artist who took the boat from Augusta, Sicily, and he moved it to Venice for the Biennale. So of course you can imagine that there was a lot of media coverage there. I had tons I could say about that initiative, but what happened was that, I'm not particularly happy about this move by these artists, but what happened was that one of the artists featuring in my exhibition is Max Hirzel, who is one of those I wanted to talk to you about, who is a photojournalist who was the only journalist and photographer who was allowed to get inside the Navy base where the forensic investigations was carried out on the 458 bodies that were recovered a year after. So as part of my exhibition, there were a video of all these photographs. And again, you can search in Hirzel migrant bodies, and you'll find them all there. So of course, when The Guardian found out about this, they wanted to interview Marx, they wanted to know more. So that triggered the whole mainstream media interest. That was an interesting process of how the mainstream discourse get a little bit closer to actions of subversion. But it worked well for us. It worked very well. So I'm happy about this, and we managed to to shout and scream our frustration about loss at sea, and to have that cover in and then one more thing I want to say, and then I say goodbye, is that the exhibition features the work of lots of refugees and asylum seekers who have themselves experienced the unauthorized route by sea. So that is something that we are always very happy to share. So yeah, that's it. That's enough from me, I think.
Thanks a lot, Federica, and indeed, I think we can thank all the speakers. First of all, those that attended in person, but also them in short, for sending his presentation. And I hope, that you found the session useful. And so I thank also the attendees, of course, that joined that are a crucial, important part of any events we can organize. And we do hope to see you in May again in 2 months. For the last session of the seminar series.